Kamal, one of the stories that attracted the most traction on the Telegraph this week has been Angela Rayner's plan to create a 16-person council on what Labour calls Islamophobia that will advise on an official government definition for anti-Muslim discrimination. That original article attracted more than 7,000 comments by readers because there are fears that these proposals could create a blasphemy law by the back door.
It certainly sparked a really big debate. It's going to put the question of being a Muslim in the UK back at the heart of the political debate. Of course, we've had the rape gangs scandal, that aggressive, unpleasant edge to some of the pro-Palestinian protests, demonstrations against Labour MPs standing in the election. And we also know, Camilla, don't we, that attacks on Muslims and Jewish people here are on the increase.
So I think the press covers the extremist angle very comprehensively, but what do moderate Muslims make of all this? On today's Daily Tea, we speak to Oxford theologian Dr Taj Hargey, dubbed Britain's liberal Imam, who has described Labour's plans as a trendy capitulation that will give a get-out-of-jail-free card to fundamentalists preaching what he describes as a hideous brand of the faith.
First off, I'm really happy that we're discussing this, but the second thing is this is really tricky.
Why? Because of your background, obviously, and heritage.
Yeah, I mean, my father came here from Sudan in the 1960s. Sudanese people are mostly Sufi Muslims. We're seen as the sort of more tolerant end of the Islamic faith. And so I've always had clearly a familial and a cultural connection to being Muslim in the UK. I find a lot of the coverage very aggressive, and it makes me tighten up when I read how extremism has taken over the debate of what it is to be a Muslim in the United Kingdom, and that Muslims, open, close quotes, are all lumped together.
Yeah.
It's like saying Christians are this, or white people are this,
Yes.
or Jewish people are that. It doesn't allow for the wonderful things that many Muslims who live and work here in the UK have done, but also I think there has been a failure to properly scrutinise and account for why so many extremist voices, which are against British values, have come under this Islamic umbrella. And I think many people, and possibly include myself, have been too nervous to step into that space because of the fear that the attacks on Muslims, which we've seen increasing, as we have seen attacks on Jewish people increasing, will only increase further if we attack extremism. But I think that we have to have a better debate about what it is to be British and Muslim, rather than simply a discussion about extremism.
Completely sympathise with your point of view. I was thinking there, you're feeling nervous discussing this, and you are of Muslim heritage, although not particularly religious.
No, I'm not practicing. I think I'm not. I probably don't even count as a cultural Muslim. I mean, my father died a number of years ago. Clearly, my family, I'm still very much in contact with my family. They have fled. Most of them have fled now Sudan and live in Europe and in North America and Canada, as well as in the UK. But I'm very much connected to the discussion, and I feel a solidarity with being Muslim in the UK. And of course, the colour of my skin marks me out as different. And I am someone who, has faced the aggression, particularly on social media, racist attacks. Why am I even here? I should go back to Somalia, etc., etc.
Which is even come from Somalia.
Exactly. So, I have had a sense, not in a totally brutal way, but I've had a sense of what it is to be a mixed black man and also of Muslim heritage in the United Kingdom. And if you go onto social media now, that has changed this idea that somehow Muslims are the enemy within, and and I say we as in all of us, are undermining the culture of Britain.
Where I come from it is as a lapsed Catholic, somebody who is intensely suspicious of religion when it is practiced in what I would regard to be an extreme way. And I mean that for all religions. I'm the daughter of a Catholic father and a Jewish stepmother, now deceased. So I suppose I would naturally have more sympathy with the pro-Israel cause than the pro-Palestine one. I think that I am suspicious and worried about our inability to comment in a moderate, meaningful and constructive manner on the Islamic faith. I'm worried by stories about Batley school teachers going into hiding because they have wanted to teach a history class about Muhammad. I'm worried about people being paraded before Muslim communities because they have dropped a Quran and need to publicly repent for it, in the same way that I'm rather disturbed by sort of high Catholic Opus Dei types and ultra-Orthodox Jews that might have what I would describe as choice attitudes towards women. I'm worried about patriarchy in religion in general that seems to oppress women and women's voices. Having said that, I do have respect for people of all faiths to practice those faiths.
Camilla, you said you were also nervous. I'm interested in
I'm
why you
nervous
say that.
because I feel that a lot of conversation about this has been shut down into if you even begin to question the Islamic faith or the behaviour of some Muslim people, ergo you're an Islamophobe. On one hand, I think that a lot of, for instance, Tommy Robinson's interest in the rape gang scandal has been fuelled by his, let's put it kindly, suspicion of Muslims and people practicing the Islamic faith. So I'm suspicious of that, but I'm also worried about the situation we found ourselves in, where rape gangs go unprosecuted for literally years because people are too worried about minding their politically correct P's and Q's. I find that extraordinary. I find this idea that we are worried about inflaming racial tensions by discussing actual rape of children by Pakistani grooming gangs, and I think it's completely wrong-headed when that in itself, that cover-up, has inflamed even greater racial tensions. I am also worried about the notion of no-go zones in some areas of the UK. And I'm worried about the idea that Jewish people in London don't feel they can get out and about on a Saturday because of the pro-Palestinian marches. All of these things do worry me, but I think it's the lack of ability to openly discuss and debate these issues without being branded a racist and a bigot that worries me the most. No religion should be above criticism, above debate, above ridicule, actually. I don't understand why there are special measures placed around Muhammad and cartoons and such like that aren't placed around Christian, Jewish, Hindu, Sikh or other iconography. I don't understand that.
There's some issues around respect there, which I think are probably for a whole nother podcast. Alongside what you've said, which I agree with, is also I don't want these discussions to be give people permission to be actually racist, because I think lots of people who are involved in this debate do believe that as a group of people, Muslims are a threat to the Judeo-Christian culture of the UK and Europe, and that people say, I'm only trying to have a discussion, and they are covering up that actually there's a different thing going on there. So I think it's both sides. I think the most important thing is to have proper, as you say, respectful, transparent discussions about this.
And the other thing is, I think we should be able to discuss things like Sharia law in an open way. I don't think we should be shying away from any of these issues. But again, people are extremely nervous because of an environment that's been created. Now, this brings us into this definition of Islamophobia, because critics of Labour's approach on this and Angela Rayner's approach on this, will give the timeline on this in just a moment, but the main criticism is that if you create a definition for Islamophobia, that it is going to prevent the very conversations that we are trying to have, because it may create an environment where it's seen as a diktat that there can't be discussions of Islam, the Islamic faith, and Muslims in general without people pointing the finger and saying you're Islamophobic.
Let's just, as you say, let's just step back and go through a bit of a history of this word, which has been used around the issues of racism against Muslims in the United Kingdom. So it was 2018 that the all-party parliamentary group wrote a report. It was a group chaired by Wes Streeting, who's now, of course, the Health Secretary. And it came up with this definition of Islamophobia, which said that Islamophobia was rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. So that definition that Labour agreed to in opposition is now going to be the subject of this consultation led by Angela Rayner, the Deputy Prime Minister, about what should be the definition used by the government.
So some APPG Islamophobia examples include perpetrating the myth of Muslim identity having a unique propensity for terrorism and claims of a demographic threat posed by Muslims or of a, quotes, Muslim takeover, accusing Muslim citizens of being more loyal to the Ummah, which is the transnational Muslim community, or to their countries of origin than to the interests of their own nations, denying Muslim populations the right to self-determination, i.e. by claiming that the existence of an independent Palestine or Kashmir is a terrorist endeavour, or using the symbols and images associated with classic Islamophobia, for instance, characterising all Muslims as being sex groomers, inherently violent or incapable of living harmoniously in plural societies.
And that's been the big controversy, hasn't it, Camilla? It's, as I said a little earlier in this podcast, this idea that Muslims are one thing, but it doesn't mean that some Muslims aren't extremist and
Yes.
are against British values.
Yes.
All we need to be sure of is that we are making sure that we are attacking and debating the right people, not just all Muslims.
Yeah, just as some Catholics may be paedophiles and may be subjugators of women, also there may be Muslims that may be paedophiles or sex offenders or indeed terrorists. I suppose what's worrying about this is, does this prevent people from saying that there are some Muslims that are those things?
So I want to go back to a policy exchange report that was written about Islamophobia after the APPG brought forward this definition. And actually a foreword written by Sajid Javid, the former Home Secretary and a Muslim. And he said that he did not believe that this very broadly defined definition was the right way to approach the problem of racism and attacks against Muslims. He wasn't saying for a moment, and neither are you or me, that somehow attacks against Muslims, as are attacks against Jewish people or anyone, because of a racial element, a racist element in this country, are wrong, and the number of attacks are increasing. But this very broad definition of what Islamophobia could be is tantamount to a possible blasphemy law and would stop us having proper discussions about British culture and what it is to be a British citizen, as well as being a person of faith. And how Labour has responded to this officially, I think, has got them into the wrong place. If the only sort of weapon you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. They want to put in place a new rule, a new regulation, a new law that actually has the opposite effect to the one they say it is supposed to have. If you think of the whole debate about non-crime hate incidents, they were meant to be an early warning system to help us understand how people go on a journey which ends up in an attack on a group of people or a terror attack. What have they become? A way of closing down free speech. And with Islamophobia, as Sajid Javid wrote in the introduction to this policy exchange report, which I would urge you to go and have a look at, because it does really get to the detail of why this is a problem, that Islamophobia could have the same effect.
One of the criticisms, Kamal, is always of the Muslim community. And not enough moderate Muslims call out the extremism in its midst. And actually, the response to this proposal by Labour from moderate Muslims has been pretty damning. Ex-Labour politician Khalid Mahmood, who had served as the Labour MP for Birmingham Parry Bar for more than 20 years and actually was unseated by an independent pro-Palestine candidate. So you might imagine, because some of the criticism of Labour has been, are you just doing this to secure your Muslim vote, in inverted commas, against some of these independents challenging you in areas of the country with high Muslim populations. And he said, no, we shouldn't just take blindly this APPG report. He says it will actually create more discrimination. It's not properly understanding the hatred that Muslims can face and tackling it. Also, Haras Rafiq, who's the director of the counter-extremism think tank and former head of the Quilliam Foundation, says, while efforts to tackle anti-Muslim hatred are welcome, it is crucial not to repeat past mistakes by conflating legitimate criticism of certain extremist interpretations of Islam with bigotry against Muslims.
And Fiaz Mughal, the founder of Tell Mama UK, which is a monitoring group that tracks complaints of anti-Muslim hate crimes, which are rapidly rising, as we've said this is classic Labour interventionism. And if the government does this, then why are they not finding a definition for anti-Sikh hate or Sikhophobia, which I know is of real concern to the British Sikh community? Or is this a pick and mix approach? Or does that community not matter to Labour politically?
Good question, that, with regard to the Sikhs, because just as people catcalled all Muslims in the aftermath of 9/11, then such was the ignorance displayed by those showing prejudice to people of colour in this country that the Sikh community had to start taking to wearing T-shirts saying, "Don't freak, I'm a Sikh." I mean, that's the kind of level of complete and utter idiocy that we're having to deal with here. Having said that, the statistics that need to be addressed not just by the Muslim community but everybody in the UK is the fact that about 67% of attacks since 2018 have been Islamist. That represents 3/4 of the MI5 caseload and about 64% of those who are currently in custody. So we know there's a problem, but how are the leading liberal Muslim voices in this country responding? Well, we have got somebody who is described as Britain's most liberal Imam. He's a theologian from Oxford. He is called Dr Taj Hargey. He's director of the Oxford Institute for British Islam, and you really do want to stay listening for what he has to say.
This discussion was certainly high energy and one of the most interesting debates we have had on this podcast in the 10 months we've been working together on the Daily Tea. Dr Taj grew up in apartheid South Africa before coming to Britain. He's a Muslim and he's been studying Islam for decades, and he's got very, very strong views about the whole debate, which he certainly delivers at pace.
Let's start by hearing his thoughts on the APPG Islamophobia definition we discussed earlier.
Well, I don't think Islamophobia is actually the correct term. I mean, the precise term would be anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Muslim sentiment. Islamophobia, we're not fearing Islam. And the idea that Muslims can be sort of racialized or placed in certain neat little categories or boxes doesn't work, because you have Muslims who are white, you have Muslims who are black, Muslims who are transgender, Muslims who are homosexuals, Muslims whatever. So who is this Islamophobia? And phobia is a fear. And I don't think we should encourage anything having a fearful perspective about Islam, because what's there to fear? Yes, there is discrimination, and we should call a spade, and that's why I think a far more accurate description for this term would be anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Muslim prejudice, bias, or whatever the case may be. But Islamophobia is a catch-all thing, and I'm actually opposed to this definition by the all-parliamentary group, because I think it's a catch-all. It brings everyone together, and if in the moment you talk about against the burqa, against the hijab, against big fat wild bushy beards, whatever, are automatically Islamophobic. No. I mean, people should have the right to be in this country, free speech. And free speech means that you're entitled to disagree with whatever someone else is doing, provided you don't advocate violence and bloodshed. You should have the right to do so. This definition of Islamophobia, from my perspective, would actually constrain any type of objective criticisms and valid denunciations of anything. Now, every religion, every ideology should be subject to stringent criticism, and Islam and Muslims should not be exempt from that. If you're going along that route and then have a catch-all that no moment you say something about Muslims and beards, Muslims and burqas, Muslim and hijab, automatically it's a hate crime or whatever the case may be, it's a palpable nonsense. if we go along this route and impose this legal definition onto the statute book, it will give all the fundamentalists, the radicals, the militants and extremists in the Muslim community a get out of jail card because then they can go out and silence all oppositions, both external and internal like me. Okay, and this is, I think, will be a disaster for this country. And if this is the case, then I might want to think about leaving United Kingdom. In fact, I regard this as my home now. But I don't want to live in a society where my free speech is constrained.
Well, there's Dr. Hargey agreeing, I think, pretty much, Camilla, with where we are. You can't lump all Muslims together. There are many, many different types of faith within Islam, and only one part of it, which he says is not even part of the Islamic faith, is extremist.
I mean, it is interesting to hear him say there should be no definition of Islamophobia as it stands at all, that he thinks that's too much of a catch-all. Also, it's Dr. Taj's view that many Muslims have moved too far from the original teachings of the Quran, the Islamic holy text. Let's hear him talk about that as a man who has studied the Quran for many, many years.
My background is that, I was born in South Africa, raised in a very apartheid situation, and I was very much against all types of injustice and discrimination, and I was forced to leave to go abroad to study. So I've always had this passionate view about justice, and justice for me was for everyone, not just for blacks, not just for whites, not just for Muslims, not just for Christians, but for everyone. And so when I came to do my doctorate at Oxford University many moons ago, I did it in Islamic studies. I realized that the Islam that I was raised in, and I come from a so-called Sunni background in Cape Town, was actually not what the Quran teaches. And that's why over the years I've developed this idea of what's something that's Quranic Islam backed by the Quran, the divine text, and something that is non-Quranic. And unfortunately, we have a situation in Britain and elsewhere that the bulk of the Muslims have theology and doctrines and dogmas that are actually non-Quranic. For example, simple things like stoning to death, not in the Quran. Things like female genital mutilation, not in the Quran. Things like wild bushy beards, not in the Quran. Hijab, niqab, not in the Quran. In the Quran, there is a word for hijab, but the word hijab in the Quran is used 8 times, by the way, and not once does it refer to women or to hair. So what does it refer to? It refers to a screen, a curtain, a barrier, a partition, a divider, a secluder, a separator. One of the 8 times, Mary, the mother of Jesus, the Quran says, is told by Gabriel, the archangel, that she will become pregnant with Jesus. What does Mary do according to the Quran? She withdraws from society, she secludes herself to focus on the pregnancy. And the Quran uses the term, she hijabs herself. So even the hijab has got no Quranic substantiation. All the stuff about Islam, I mean, anything egregious in the news, if you look at it, it's got no Quranic validation whatsoever. And even the verses in the Quran that talks about violence, it's usually cherry-picked by Muslims and by non-Muslims. For example, the Quran says, when you're faced with a catastrophic threat of annihilation, then you have the right to kill them wherever you find them. And when Churchill in the 1940s was saying, we'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them on the hills, we'll fight them wherever, and we will never, never surrender. How come that's applauded? And the Quran is saying the same thing. When you are faced with the existential threat of annihilation, then you do have the right to go out and get them. But the Quran also says you can only have violence or engage in violence for defensive purposes. Number 1, when you are persecuted for your religion. And number 2, when you are driven from your homes. Here in Britain, I am not persecuted for my religion and I'm not driven from my home. So I have no reason to take up arms whatsoever. So the word jihad in the Quran talks about struggle and striving and not about warfare. And this concept of a holy war is a nonsense. How can war ever be holy? It's an oxymoron.
What Dr. Taj hits on there, and this is part of the problem when it comes to this debate, not many people have read the Quran. and it's open to interpretations that others can't challenge simply because they don't have the knowledge.
Well, just like the Bible.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, have you read the Quran cover to cover?
I have.
Well done. I haven't read the Bible.
Don't test me on it, though. It was many, many years ago.
No.
I've actually got my father's Quran at home.
Also, Dr. Taj's perspective is interesting considering that he grew up in apartheid South Africa, isn't it? So he's said that he is basically speaking out because he has nothing to fear, because when you grow up being as oppressed as he has, basically you have to just throw caution to the wind. And he absolutely refuses to, in his own words, kowtow to radical imams and preachers.
And then he has this rather wonderful definition that he describes as the toxic trio. These are the reasons why these radical imams have been allowed to flourish.
I think Islam has been totally warped and contaminated by the toxic trio. The toxic trio of Islamic theology. So very briefly, let's go back into this. So we have the Quran, and most Muslims, by either believing or not, or what do you call it, nominal Muslims, doesn't really matter. Most of them accept this as a word of God. Subsequent to this, Muhammad dies in the year 632. Subsequent to this, we have the emergence over centuries of the toxic trio. So what's the toxic trio? And these toxic trio, the terrible triplets, I call it as well, they have now superseded and replaced the Quran. So what are these three? Number one, it is the hadith, the supposed sayings of Muhammad written down, compiled 300 years and more after his death. So there is no real authenticity. In fact, in many cases, it's just a bunch of Chinese whispers. And these things countermand and supersede the Quran. For example, the Quran says men and women must go to Friday prayers. Most women don't go to Friday prayers because they have been told by the hadith they get more reward by not going to the mosque. They get more rewards praying at their homes. So the hadith has countermanded the Quran. And the list goes on. We don't have time for that, but I can give many more examples. The second part of the toxic trio is the Sharia. Sharia is not divine law. It is medieval opinion posing, masquerading as divine law. And this only comes into vogue about 400 or 500 years after the death of Muhammad. So it's just medieval opinion. And we can go through a litany of that as well, you know, and expose its anti-Quranic foundations. And the third is the fatwas. And the most egregious one, of course, is Salman Rushdie's one. Okay, fatwas. What are fatwas? Fatwas is an individual opinion by a cleric about certain issues. That's all it is. But when we have the combination, this toxic combination of the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad, combined with the Sharia, the so-called divine law, combined with the fatwas, those three things supersede the Quran totally. And this is what I'm fighting against. So when we have the Oxford Institute for British Islam, we want to get back to the roots, sola scriptura, back to the scripture, and not to all this man-made stuff. Now, I, as a Quranic Muslim, I live perfectly well in this society. I walk out of this building, I walk into your newsroom, they don't know I'm Muslim as I am, because I have nothing discernibly Muslim about me. I've got no beard, I've got no cap, I've got no gown, because Islam is not on my sleeve. Islam is in my heart. And this type of Islam is what's needed, a Quranic Islam. Now, I have issues with all these other fundamentalists and radicals, and I don't. The best way to describe them is not actually as Muslims. They are Mohammedans. What they have done is to elevate the personage of Muhammad, and he takes precedence over everything else. So the messenger has become more important than the message. The most hideous transgression is putting up partners with God. So when Muslims put Muhammad up there, and God down below, so to speak, in terms of the hierarchy of theology, that's what they have done.
The other big question I have, and again, by the way, a lot of this stereotyping of Muslims is just born out of a lack of communication, I think, between people who are non-Muslims and Muslims. Maybe that's born out of this kind of culture of silence, fear of people not offending anyone. Are we actually asking enough questions of each other in all this? And so I wanted to ask Dr. Taj, look, why is it that so many Muslims seem to be listening to these imams and preachers, even though it probably feels quite counterintuitive to them at times, and also just can he try and quantify how big the extremism issue is in this country? This is what he said.
Okay, so I've done some anecdotal work on this. 5% of this whole lot are now ex-Muslims. At best, they are nominal Muslims, but they don't pray, they don't fast, they do nothing. They don't, Muhammad becomes Mo, Ali becomes Al, stuff like that. Okay,
That's me, I think.
Sounds
Camilla.
like my lapsed Catholicism. Yeah,
Yes.
go on.
Okay, all right. Okay, so that's 5%. Okay, then about 10 to 15% are people like me, the progressives, the liberals, the educated in professional classes. They are there. Okay, they're actually the movers and shakers of the society. 75 to 80% are the rank and file, believing blindly. And you know what the Quran actually says in chapter 9, verse 31? The Quran says, Muslims, do not make the mistakes of Jews and Christians. So what mistake, according to the Quran, did Jews and Christians, Catholics make? The Quran says, Christians and Jews have made their rabbis, their priests, and their monks as little gods. And the Quran warns us not to make the Ayatollah, the Maulana, the Mufti, the Sheikh, and the Imam a little god. But the 75 to 80% just believes what these little gods say.
So there is a responsibility for the Muslim population in Britain to also think differently and be different.
Now that 10 to 15%, I'm expecting them to do it, the lawyers, the dentists, the doctors, and so forth. Okay? Now, I've also made this criticism, and some people don't like it, but I say it nevertheless. Most British Muslims are schizophrenic, so hear me out. They make the best dentists, doctors, lawyers, engineers, architects, you name it, whatever, and they operate rationally and logically. That same dentist, doctor, when she goes to the mosque at night, she becomes a zombie. She's an automatic pilot. Whatever the stupid mullah tells her, she believes it. Use the analogy of a bird. So logically, on the secular wing, the secular level, this wing is flapping. On the other wing, this wing is not flapping. And all that bird will do is go round and round. It will never fly. And that is the problem with our Muslims. Okay, so that 10, 15% there, we are not doing the job of educating the masses. Now, for example, the Oxford Centre Institute for British Islam, we are looking at just educating maybe 1 to 5% of the population. We don't need bulk numbers. We need to show them logically, conclusively, here's the book. This is what the Quran says. No stoning in the Quran. So why are you thinking stoning is good? Why do you think instant divorce is fine? Talak, talak, talak 3 times. The Quran doesn't say that. All of these things, whatever egregious stuff is happening out in the community, you can show in the chapter and verse that this is a post-Muhammadan theological innovation and countermanding and superseding the divine text. And this is where I'm on such good ground. For example, we are the only group that does interfaith marriages between Muslim women and non-Muslim men without the men having to convert. Because nowhere in the Quran does it say they have to convert. All the Quran says they should be monotheistic. That is all. So we do it. Okay? So if your name
Do you have any marriages between Muslims and Jews?
Yeah, great couple. The Jewish man remain a Jew and the Muslim woman remain a Muslim.
And as we always try to do, Camilla, what are the solutions? Not just let's identify the problems, which, as you say, many people are doing outside the rather hallowed walls of the Oxford Institute and Dr Taj himself. What is happening? How do we get a debate which allows proper reflection of liberal Muslim successful voices so that we can change the terms of this vital discussion?
I've been fighting for 20 years, Kamal, showing this liberal alternative view, and I can back it up with scripture and theology. This is the point, okay? The other side can't do it. Liberal voices, progressive voices, moderate voices, whatever adjective you want to give, these voices must be the antidote to the radicals and the fundamentalists. We need to neuter their ideology. It's not theology, their ideology. And we can neuter them. If we have a regular platform, whether it's by the mainstream media or even by social media, whatever, we can do so. But the British public has to make a choice. Do we support liberal, progressive, moderate voices, or do we just try to prevent, so to word, and suppress these radicals? That's never going to work. You need voices like me and from the liberal voices to beat them theologically.
Well, it may be the media's fault, Kamal, but it isn't the Daily Teas, because we, unlike the BBC, have given Dr Taj a platform. Really intrigued, actually, for your reaction to that discussion, because, to be honest, it wasn't something I'd really heard before. I don't think we, as the press, do speak to a wide enough range of voices on this issue. I think we tend to be quite knee-jerk, and this is the story, and this is going to be how we present it. So it's actually just refreshing to hear him speak so candidly, so fearlessly. Many may disagree with him, many will agree, but that's the whole point, that we're actually just giving some air. We're actually giving a platform to some of these views so we can try and discuss it, rather than kind of like living in fear of our own shadow when discussing this particular issue.
It'll be fascinating to hear what you think, our audience think, about what they've heard. We're looking forward to your comments on it. Do write in to the Daily Tea at telegraph.co.uk or on our socials at Daily Tea Podcast. You're right, there will probably be a lot of people who will attack Dr. Taj, but I found the discussion energizing, incredibly useful as a balance against a lot of the media discussion, a lot of the social media discussion only being concerned with extremism and the threat of extremism. And there is a whole different community of different parts of the Muslim faith and non-Muslim faith, i.e. cultural Muslims, people who are not of the faith, but of course people like me who have a heritage that is Islamic and are very proud of that, the great joy that that brings us as human beings and what Islam has brought over the many, many centuries to the whole world, and want that pride alongside a pride in being British. I'm also very proud of being British. I'm patriotic about this great country and what it's given me and my family. So something that allows us to have these debates. I've actually been asked to join or to come along and maybe report on. I won't join. I'm a journalist, so I don't join sort of groups because, you know, we are independent of interest groups. But there's this new organisation called the British Muslim Network, which is going to be launched, I think it's either next week or the week after. It's people like Michelle Hussein, Baroness Saeeda Varsi. It'll be leading Muslim lawyers, leading doctors, scientists, people from sort of, you know, charities, people who work in engineering, just to show the ordinariness of Muslims being successful in the United Kingdom and still being of the Islamic faith. I think that's one way we can do it. And then I just wanted to also say to you, Camilla, I read this lovely piece in the Jewish Chronicle from February the 11th. King meets chief rabbi and prominent imams as faith leaders sign groundbreaking reconciliation accords. And there's a wonderful picture of King Charles at Buckingham Palace welcoming the chief rabbi, welcoming many prominent Muslim imams and other Jewish figures to sign this landmark agreement, which is all about interfaith solidarity amid all these rising tensions in the United Kingdom. King Charles, the group that he brought together there, the British Muslim Network, Dr. Taj, these are the types of people that we should be listening to, and we should be prosecuting those people who are the extremists and who threaten British values and threaten the way of life that we love, be living in a liberal country where everyone can practice their faith as long as it doesn't have a negative effect on other people.